Most people know the name Trump. It's stamped on towers, headlines, and history itself. But long before the fame, before the politics, there was a man who rarely spoke in public, who never sought the spotlight, yet quietly built the foundation of everything that followed. His name was Fred Trump. By the time he retired, his properties housed an entire city's worth of people, tens of thousands of units, all built with a simple, quiet partnership, his ambition and the American government's money. He wasn't a celebrity or a politician or a showman. He was a builder, not just of homes, but of opportunity, strategy, and influence. And his genius was understanding something few Americans ever noticed, that the rules meant to rebuild the nation could also be used to build personal power. While much of the country was struggling through the Great Depression, Fred Trump was studying the fine print of government programs designed to restore it. He learned the language of policy, the guarantees, the subsidies, the quiet partnerships between builders and Washington. When the New Deal reshaped America's housing system, Fred saw what others didn't, that the promise of affordable homes for all also created a network of incentives that could turn a small developer into a local empire. He didn't break the rules. He mastered them. By the 1940s, his projects stretched across Queens and Brooklyn, brick by brick, contract by contract, each one backed, insured, or subsidized by the federal government. Historians often describe Fred Trump as one of the first developers to truly understand how public policy and private business could intertwine. He built homes for veterans returning from war, managed millions in federal housing funds, and turned government-backed loans into lasting wealth. But every system that creates opportunity also draws its boundaries. The same policies that made Fred Trump successful also excluded many Americans from that success. They shaped not only the skyline of New York, but the social map of who was allowed to live where and who wasn't. Fred Trump's story isn't just about real estate. It's about a moment in American history when policy and profit became partners, and how one man understood that partnership better than anyone else. This is the story of Fred Trump, the builder who turned government policy into power, and in doing so, helped define what the American dream would look like for generations to come. Fred Trump's story began with another man, his father, Friedrich Trump, a German immigrant who arrived in America with almost nothing. He cut hair, cooked meals, searched for gold in the frozen North. By the time he settled in New York, he had built a small fortune, running hotels and restaurants. He married, bought land in Queens, and dreamed of stability. Then came 1918. The influenza pandemic swept across the world. Friedrich caught it, and within days, he was gone. Fred was only 12. That single loss changed everything. The family had money for a while, but no direction, and a quiet fear settled inside the boy, that life could fall apart overnight. He watched his mother, Elizabeth, hold the family together, balancing books, managing properties, collecting rent from tenants who were struggling just like them. She became the first example of strength Fred would ever know. By his teens, Fred wasn't playing baseball or going to dances. He was learning ledgers, tools, timing, following workers through construction sites, asking questions about walls, bricks, and costs. Every dollar mattered. Every mistake felt like danger. He built his first garage before he turned 20. It was small, plain, practical, but it worked. Neighbors noticed. He fixed roofs, poured concrete, built small homes for local families. Each project taught him something simple but powerful. If you could control how money was spent, you didn't have to fear losing it. That idea became his anchor. By 1923, while most kids his age were still finding jobs, Fred Trump had started his own company. He called it E. Trump and Son, using his mother's name to sign the papers because he wasn't yet 21. He worked quietly, efficiently, almost obsessively. He didn't drink, He didn't waste time, and he kept his profits close. People said Fred was calm but calculating, friendly on the surface, guarded underneath. He never forgot what it felt like to lose his father. He never wanted to feel that kind of uncertainty again. When the 1920s real estate boom began, Fred was ready. He built small homes across Queens, sold them for modest profit, then reinvested immediately. No celebration, no risk, just growth, one brick at a time. He treated money like oxygen. Never too much, never wasted, always controlled. But success didn't soften him. It made him sharper. He studied the city's building codes until he could quote them from memory. He learned how to negotiate with suppliers, how to stretch every dollar of lumber and steel. While other builders talked about art and design, Fred talked about cost per unit. He didn't want beauty, he wanted security. That focus earned him respect, but also distance. People described him as disciplined, even secretive. He worked early, slept little, trusted few. Still, for a young man who started with fear, control felt like safety. And in a city that was always changing, safety was power. Then, 1929. The stock market crashed, banks failed. People lost their homes, their savings, their faith in the future. Fred didn't panic. He saw patterns, the same uncertainty he had known as a boy. But this time he wasn't helpless. He had property, cash, a plan. He tightened his circle, cut every expense, and waited. While others fell, he stayed standing. And as the Great Depression deepened, new opportunities began to appear, slow at first, then faster. Government programs were forming, desperate to rebuild confidence in housing. Fred watched carefully. He sensed something new taking shape, something big. The government wanted builders. He was already one. All he needed was to understand their rules. In the next decade, those rules would change his life and America's skyline. But in these early years, one truth was already clear. Fred Trump wasn't building for ambition. He was building so he'd never lose control again. The crash of 1929 broke America's confidence. Banks failed. Jobs vanished. Families lost homes they'd worked for all their lives. By the early 1930s, whole blocks of New York sat empty. Developers went bankrupt. But in Washington, a new idea was forming. A plan to rebuild the nation, brick by brick. It was called the New Deal. President Franklin D. Roosevelt promised to restart the economy by putting people back to work, in factories, on bridges, highways, and in homes. The country needed housing that ordinary families could afford. So the government created a new agency, the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA. Its mission was simple: make banks feel safe lending money again. Here's how it worked. If a builder followed the FHA's rules, used approved materials, standard designs, safe neighborhoods, the government would guarantee the loan. If anything went wrong, Washington would cover the losses. For builders, it was a dream. For Fred Trump, it was the moment he'd been waiting for. He read the guidelines, every line, every form, every requirement, and he realized something most people didn't. This wasn't charity. It was a system. Money now flowed in a new pattern, government to banks, to builders to tenants. Fred no longer needed to risk his own fortune. The federal guarantee became his safety net. He could build bigger, faster, safer, because the government carried the risk. He started small, modest brick houses across Queens and Brooklyn, all FHA approved. Priced for working-class families, just under the government limits. They sold quickly, and each sale gave him the capital for the next project. He was no longer just a builder. He was an architect of leverage. A historian once said, Fred Trump understood the alphabet of the New Deal better than most in Washington. That might be true. He spoke its language fluently: forms, fees, interest rates, guarantees. While others worried about recovery, he was already expanding. By 1939, his company was handling millions in construction contracts. Then came war. When the United States entered World War II, the demand for housing exploded. The military needed homes for workers near shipyards and factories. The government turned again to private builders, and Fred Trump was ready. He secured contracts to build barracks, apartments, and family units for Navy personnel. Every project financed by federal money. Every payment guaranteed. It was the perfect partnership. America needed homes. Fred Trump knew how to deliver them. By the time peace returned, he had built thousands of units and made millions in profit. All with almost no personal risk. Fred didn't gamble. He calculated. And the government paid for it. His projects shaped entire neighborhoods, neat rows of brick homes, clean streets, tidy lawns. To many, he was a symbol of American recovery, a man who turned policy into progress. But beneath the success, the system had limits few wanted to see. The FHA's rules didn't just decide who could build, they decided where people could live. Neighborhoods marked as risky were denied funding. And in that era, risky often meant black or immigrant communities. The practice became known as redlining. It drew invisible borders through American cities, offering opportunity to some and exclusion to others. Fred built inside those safe lines and prospered. Families who fit the FHA's profile moved into his developments. Those who didn't were often left outside the map. Fred didn't invent those rules, but he worked within them, and that choice would shape both his fortune and his legacy. By the mid-1940s, Fred Trump was more than a successful builder. He was a product of the New Deal, a man who had learned that true power didn't come from breaking the system. It came from understanding how it worked better than anyone else. Yet every system, no matter how profitable, eventually changes. New programs, new cities, new ambitions. Fred's next challenge would come not from Washington, but from inside his own family. From a son who wanted to build something very different. By the late 1940s, Fred Trump's name was known across New York. His company had built thousands of homes for returning soldiers and their families. Neat red brick rows stretched across Queens and Brooklyn, Beach Haven, Shore Haven, Trump Village. To many, he looked like the man who had rebuilt the American middle class. He worked the same way he always had, quiet, disciplined, methodical. He watched every dollar, ordered materials in bulk, standardized designs until building homes felt almost like running a factory. People called him the Henry Ford of housing, and in some ways, he was. Fred could build faster and cheaper than almost anyone else. He knew how to cut waste, how to get approvals, how to finish entire blocks on schedule. He was proud of efficiency, proud of control, but control always comes at a cost. As his empire grew, so did the complaints. Tenants said repairs were slow, walls were thin, rents kept climbing. Fred saw these as numbers, not stories. He ran housing like an engineer, not a landlord. Still, to the city, he was a success story. To the federal government, proof that the system worked. Then a new sound began to echo through those same red brick walls, a song. In 1950, folk singer Woody Guthrie rented an apartment in Beach Haven. He wrote lyrics about his landlord, Old Man Trump, a man whose buildings looked perfect, but divided people by color and class. It was part protest, part warning. The melody faded with time. But the question remained, who was really welcome in Fred Trump's version of the American dream? For Fred, the criticism didn't matter. He believed in numbers, not noise. He built by the book, the government's book, and saw himself as the model of what those policies were meant to create. Then came 1954. A federal investigation accused him of overbilling the government on a major housing project. It was settled without criminal charges, but the story made headlines and left a mark. Fred didn't forget it. It reminded him how quickly success could be questioned, how even a system he'd mastered could turn against him. He became more cautious, more private, trusted fewer people, and doubled down on what he knew best: control. At home, that same control shaped everything. Fred was strict, structured, unemotional. Dinner felt more like a meeting than a meal. He taught his children to think in terms of gain and loss. Everything had value, even relationships. Donald, his fourth child, paid close attention. He followed his father to construction sites, watched how he negotiated, how he used numbers like weapons. Donald learned that success wasn't just about what you built. It was about how loudly you built it. Where Fred admired efficiency, Donald admired attention. Where Fred avoided the spotlight, Donald chased it. Fred built systems. Donald would build symbols. But in the 1950s and early 60s, that difference didn't matter. Not yet. Fred was still the master of his world. The houses stood solid, the rent came in, and the system he had trusted for decades kept rewarding him. Still, cracks were forming. The city was changing, new neighborhoods, new politics, new kinds of competition. The same government that had once paid for his projects was now beginning to regulate them. And at home, the balance of power was shifting too. Fred's children were growing up. Donald wanted more than stability. He wanted scale, recognition, risk. Fred didn't understand that. To him, risk was danger. To Donald, it was opportunity. The quiet builder and the loud dreamer were heading for a crossroads. Fred couldn't see it yet, but every empire built on leverage eventually tests its foundation. By the 1970s, Fred Trump was a rich man. He owned thousands of apartments across New York. He had outlasted recessions, rivals, and regulators, but time spares no builder. His hair turned white, his steps slowed. The sharp mind that once held every number, every address, began to fade. He still visited his offices, still signed papers, but the figures didn't add up as easily anymore. At home, control began to slip. His children were grown. The business divided between them. Each had learned from him in a different way. Some inherited his caution. One, Donald, inherited his ambition. Fred admired that drive, yet feared the risk. He believed debt was danger. Donald believed debt was power. Their conversations became lessons. Their lessons, arguments. Fred had spent his life avoiding uncertainty. Donald was chasing it. Still, Fred was proud. He saw in his son the confidence he never allowed himself to show. When Donald built in Manhattan, Fred backed him quietly, signing loans, giving advice, watching from the shadows. But there was another son, Freddie Trump, gentle, kind, a pilot by heart, not a businessman. Fred never understood him. He measured worth in numbers, not in joy. Freddie wanted freedom, not control. And in a house ruled by control, freedom looked like failure. The distance between father and son grew heavy. Freddie struggled with alcohol. In 1981, he died at just 43. The loss should have brought the family closer. It didn't. Fred rarely spoke about Freddie's death. Work filled the silence. The empire kept running, rents kept coming, but the family felt smaller, colder. By the 1990s, age had caught up. Fred's memory slipped further. Doctors called it dementia. Meetings grew shorter. Decisions passed to his children. And then came a new kind of conflict, the one no family escapes: inheritance. Fred began planning his estate. It was massive. Properties, cash, trust funds, spread across decades of business. Donald took the lead. Valuations, transfers, revisions. Everything looked orderly on paper. But after Fred's death in 1999, questions surfaced. Some family members believed assets had been undervalued, that the true worth of his empire was hidden behind bookkeeping, the same precision that had once built it. Lawsuits followed, statements, denials, settlements. To outsiders, it looked like money. To the family, it felt like betrayal. Fred had built for security, but his empire ended in conflict. The man who mastered systems could not master family. He left behind buildings that would stand for generations, but relationships that cracked the moment control was gone. In the end, the habits that made him strong also made him distant. He managed his business like an engineer, and his family like a ledger. What couldn't be measured, he struggled to understand. Still, in those final years, when his mind drifted between clarity and confusion, he sometimes spoke of the early days, the Depression, the first garages, the government programs that made it all possible. He said those were good years, simple years, years when everything had a reason and a rule. Perhaps that was the only world where he ever felt safe, a world he could organize, calculate, control. But even the most careful builder cannot blueprint human hearts. Fred Trump's empire survived him. The apartments still stand. The wealth still moves through generations. Yet the family behind it carries both his discipline and his distance. His story ends where it began, in Queens, among the same red brick houses that built his fortune and framed his fears. He once believed control was the key to security. In the end, it was the wall that kept him apart. The story ends where it began, in Queens. Rows of red brick houses still stand where Fred Trump once built his first empire. The lawns are smaller now. The paint has faded. But the design remains the same, efficient, identical, controlled. Each home carries a quiet piece of history. They were built with public guarantees, federal loans, and one man's understanding of how to use them. Decades later, the rules have changed, but not the pattern. Government programs still shape markets. Tax breaks still reward builders. Incentives still decide which neighborhoods rise and which are left behind. Fred Trump may be gone, but his playbook remains everywhere. From suburban developments to luxury towers, the dance between public policy and private ambition continues. Only now, it's bigger, faster, and far more complex. It raises a question that echoes beyond Queens. If power comes from understanding the rules, who really builds America? The dreamers or the rule makers? Fred Trump didn't invent the system. He simply saw what others ignored. That in every era, the structure of opportunity is written in fine print. His genius wasn't invention. It was interpretation. He read the language of government and turned it into private strength. And in doing so, he built more than homes. He built a model, one that others would follow, refine, and expand. His son Donald took that model to a different stage. Where Fred worked with contracts and codes, Donald worked with cameras and crowds. Where Fred built quietly, Donald built loudly. But the foundation was the same: leverage, visibility, and the power of the deal. One generation mastered the system. The next mastered attention. Both understood the same truth: that power favors those who learn to use the rules before anyone else does. Fred Trump's story isn't a scandal. It's a mirror. It reflects how ambition and policy have always shaped each other. How success in America often depends not only on effort, but on access, timing, and the courage to see opportunity where others see paperwork. For some, that truth feels unfair. For others, it feels inspiring. For history, it's simply reality. The American dream was never just about hard work. It was about understanding the structure behind it, who writes the rules, and who learns how to use them. Fred Trump understood both. He saw the government not as a referee, but as a partner. And in that partnership, he found power. When we look at the skyline now, the towers, the suburbs, the endless rows of homes, we see more than buildings. We see the blueprint of a country built by individuals and institutions moving in the same rhythm, each shaping the other. Fred Trump's life was one version of that rhythm, a story of calculation, control, and consequence. His houses may not stand tall like the towers that came later, but they stand longer. They remind us that history isn't only written in headlines. Sometimes it's poured in concrete, lined in brick, and financed by policies most people never notice. He believed security came from mastery. And in a way, he was right. He mastered his world completely. He just couldn't master what came after. The man who turned government policy into power left behind a question that still matters. What kind of power do we build when ambition and policy move hand in hand? The answer is all around us, in every mortgage form, every tax break, every skyline silhouette. Fred Trump's story isn't only about the past, it's about the blueprint of the present. And as long as the system rewards those who understand it best, his legacy will never truly fade.